I started feeling sick every morning after my daughter made me coffee. When I found poison hidden in her bathroom, my hands shook. The next morning, I quietly switched our cups. She smiled sweetly, took a sip, and her face went white. Then she whispered something that made my blood run cold. Subscribe to the channel, leave your like, and comment from which part of the world you are watching. Get comfortable and relax. Let's begin. The nausea arrived first, a low, familiar tide in my stomach. I opened my eyes to the bedroom's gray dawn light and waited for the wave to pass. It did not. This was the new pattern. I told myself it was age, a body's natural betrayal after 53 years. A spoonful of sugar helps the medicine go down, my mother used to sing. My medicine was denial, and I took it daily. I heard movement downstairs, the predictable sounds of Simone's morning, the soft click of the coffee maker being prepared, the opening and closing of a cabinet door. Routine was our anchor. I pushed myself upright, the motion sending a fresh curl of discomfort through my gut. I breathed through it, the way I used to coach laboring mothers. Breathe in, 2, 3. Breathe out, 2, 3. By the time I made it to the kitchen, the room was bright with morning sun and the rich, bitter scent of brewing coffee. Simone stood at the counter, her back to me, a silhouette of practiced efficiency. She turned, and her face arranged itself into a smile. It was a beautiful smile, white and even, the kind people compliment. "Morning, Mama. You're up late." She poured coffee into my favorite mug, the thick ceramic one with the chipped handle my husband Charles had given me. The steam rose in a gentle curl. "Didn't sleep well," I said, my voice gravelly. I took my seat at the small sunlit table. "You never do anymore." Her tone was light, concerned. She brought the mug to me, setting it down with a soft click on the wooden surface. "Maybe cut back on the caffeine. I made it a little lighter today." I looked at the dark liquid. "My coffee is the one thing I shouldn't have to dilute, child." She laughed, a melodic sound that once filled me with pure joy. Now, it sometimes felt like a note held for too long. Stubborn, just like Daddy. She said it fondly, always linking me to him. She returned to the counter to prepare her own cup. I watched her. At 28, Simone was the picture of composed adulthood. Her hair was always neat, her clothes simple but sharp. She had a good job, paid a modest rent to stay in my house, and asked after my health with a nurse's attentiveness. I was proud. I was also increasingly tired. I lifted the mug and took the first sip. It was perfect. Hot, strong, just a touch of sweetness already stirred in. Simone knew how I took it. The warmth spread through my chest, a momentary comfort. Then, a few minutes later, the cramp returned, sharper this time, just below my ribs. I placed a hand there, pressing lightly. "You okay?" Simone was watching me, her own mug halfway to her lips. "Indigestion," I said. "It's nothing." "You've been saying that for weeks. Maybe you should see Dr. Evans again." "I am a retired nurse, Simone. I know indigestion." "You also know doctors make the worst patients." She took a sip of her coffee, her eyes steady on me over the rim. Her gaze was assessing, clinical. I saw my daughter, but for a fleeting second, I saw a colleague checking a patient's pallor. The thought was uncharitable, and I dismissed it. This was my child, my only child. We drank in a silence that used to be comfortable. The clock on the wall ticked. A car passed outside. I finished my coffee, the dregs cold and overly sweet. The cramp had settled into a dull, persistent ache. "I have to run," Simone said, rising. She took our empty mugs to the sink. She rinsed them both, her movements quick and thorough. "Big presentation today, don't overdo it. There's leftover chicken in the fridge for lunch." "I'll be fine," I said. She came over, bent, and kissed my cheek. Her perfume was subtle, a hint of jasmine. "Love you, Mama. Love you more." I listened to the sounds of her departure, the jingle of keys, the opening of the front door, the solid click as it shut. The house sighed into quiet. The sunlight seemed too cheerful. I sat at the table, my hand still pressed to my abdomen. This was more than aging. The fatigue was bone deep, a weight in my limbs. My thoughts, usually sharp, felt frayed at the edges. I had blamed grief for so long, first for Charles, then for the life I thought we'd have, but this was a different erosion. A memory surfaced, unbidden. Charles, in his last year. He sat at this very table, a skeleton in a bathrobe, his hands trembling around his morning coffee. He could barely lift the mug. I would help him, guiding it to his lips. "My hands don't work anymore, Ellie," he'd whispered once, his voice full of a shame that broke me. "It's the medicine, sweetheart," I'd say. "It's just the medicine." I made his coffee weak with extra milk, trying to get calories into him. He hated it. He wanted it dark and strong, the way I drank it. Towards the end, he stopped wanting anything at all. The memory was a physical pain, sharper than the one in my gut. I pushed it down. That was years ago. Simone and I had survived it together. We had healed. At least I believed we had. I stood, my knees protesting. The room tilted slightly, then righted itself. Vertigo. Another new symptom to add to the list. I walked slowly to the sink and looked out the window at the backyard. The garden needed tending. Charles's garden. I hadn't had the energy to keep it up. My reflection in the window glass was faint. A woman with silver-streaked hair pulled into a loose bun, features drawn with a fatigue no amount of sleep seemed to cure. The distinguished streaks I used to be proud of now just looked like streaks of gray. I looked older than my years. I felt ancient. I turned on the tap and washed the 2 mugs Simone had left in the sink. I washed them carefully, methodically, the way I used to scrub surgical instruments. Hot water, soap, a thorough rinse. I placed them in the dish rack to dry. The routine was grounding. This was my home. These were my things. This was my life. But as I dried my hands on a towel, a cold, thin wire of doubt threaded its way through the fog of my illness. It was not a loud thought. It was a whisper, a question. Why did I only feel this bad in the mornings, after my coffee? After the coffee Simone made for me? I shook my head. The motion made the room swim. Nonsense. That was grief and sickness talking, twisting a daughter's care into something sinister. Simone was my heart. She was all I had left. I decided to lie down. As I walked back through the quiet house, the silence felt different. It no longer felt peaceful. It felt like waiting. The cramp in my stomach tightened its grip, a faithful, terrible companion. This was my new normal. I accepted it that morning, as I had for weeks. I told myself it was the price of time, the cost of survival. I was wrong. It was the price of trust, and the cost was only beginning to come due. The quiet of the house did not bring rest. I lay on my bed, the morning sun now a bright rectangle on the opposite wall, and cataloged my symptoms with a nurse's detached precision. Nausea, abdominal cramping, fatigue, vertigo, cognitive fuzziness. Taken individually, they suggested a dozen common ailments for a woman my age. Taken together, following a specific daily trigger, they formed a different pattern. A pattern I had been trained to recognize, but had refused to see. I am not a hysterical woman. I dealt with blood, trauma, and death for 32 years in the ER. I understand cause and effect. The whisper of doubt from the kitchen grew into a clear, cold statement in the stillness of my bedroom. The correlation was too consistent. I felt worst in the hours after my morning coffee. On the weekends when Simone slept in and I made my own, the symptoms were milder, almost negligible. I had attributed that to relaxation. Now I reconsidered. A professional curiosity, grim and clinical, overrode the churning fear. I needed data. Observation first, then action. I began that afternoon. When Simone returned from work, her smile was in place, her questions about my day solicitous. "Did you eat the chicken?" "I wasn't hungry," I said. It was the truth. "Mama, you have to keep your strength up." There was a flicker in her eyes. Not concern, but something like impatience. She moved to the kitchen. "I'll make us some tea." I watched her. I noted how she filled the kettle, used tea bags from the communal box, poured the boiling water. She brought 2 identical mugs to the living room. No special preparation. I drank the tea. I felt no change in my condition. The data point was recorded. The next morning, the ritual repeated. The sound of the coffee grinder, the smell of brewing. She presented me with my mug. "I made it extra strong today. You look like you need it." I thanked her. I took a sip, letting the flavor sit on my tongue. It was smooth, slightly sweeter than I would make it myself. I watched her drink from her own mug, her movements casual. I felt the first twinge in my stomach within 20 minutes. By the time she left for work, a dull headache had joined the cramp. I stood in the silent kitchen, my hand flat on the countertop. The evidence was circumstantial, but mounting. A former nurse relies on empirical data. My body was providing it. The next step was to search for the agent. I did not allow myself to think the word poison. Not yet. I framed it as looking for a contaminant, a spoiled creamer, a mold in the coffee tin. I checked everything in the open: the coffee beans, the grinder, the sugar bowl, the small refrigerator for cream. All were normal, clean, fresh. Then I considered the private spaces. My bathroom contained only my things. Simone's bathroom down the hall was her domain. She was fastidious. If there was something she did not want me to see, that is where it would be. The logic was inescapable. I waited until I heard her car pull away. My heart was a steady, heavy drum in my chest. I walked down the hallway to her bathroom. The door was unlocked. I turned the knob. The room smelled of her perfume and minty toothpaste. Everything was orderly, towels folded on the rack, products lined neatly on the glass shelf above the sink. The light was cold and fluorescent. I started with the medicine cabinet. It was a predictable array: ibuprofen, allergy pills, multivitamins, dental floss, bandages. Nothing unusual. I checked under the sink. Cleaning supplies, extra toilet paper, a box of tampons. My movements were systematic, my breathing controlled. I was not a mother snooping. I was a nurse conducting a survey. I was an investigator gathering facts. I opened the linen cabinet next to the shower. Stacked towels, washcloths, a few unused bars of soap. My hand moved behind the stacks of terry cloth, feeling for anything out of place. My fingers brushed against something cool and smooth, cylindrical. It was tucked behind the final stack of towels at the very back of the shelf. I pulled it out. It was a small glass vial about 2 inches tall with a dropper top. It was 3/4 full of a clear, viscous liquid. There was no label, no prescription sticker, no manufacturer's name, just plain, clean glass. I held it up to the light. The liquid was colorless. It looked like water, but it moved more slowly, clinging to the sides of the glass. I unscrewed the dropper top. There was no odor. None at all. That in itself was strange. Most substances, even water, have a scent. The weight of the vial in my palm was negligible, but it seemed to anchor me to the spot. This was not a food item. This was not medicine. This was something hidden. A cold clarity washed over me, erasing the last of the mental fog. This was the agent. The correlation now had a physical correlate. The symptoms, the timing, the hidden vial, the pieces aligned into a picture of such profound betrayal that my mind could not immediately absorb it. I simply observed the facts. My daughter brought me coffee every morning. I became ill. She hid an unmarked vial in her bathroom. I recapped the vial. My hands were steady. I placed it back exactly where I had found it, behind the towels. I rearranged the stacks to their original order. I closed the linen cabinet door. I left the bathroom, turning off the light. I walked back to my bedroom. I sat on the edge of my bed. The sunlight was warm on my legs. Outside, a bird sang. The ordinary world continued. I replayed every smile, every touch, every concerned word from the past weeks. They rearranged themselves in this new light. They were not acts of love. They were monitoring. They were performance. The attentiveness was to observe the effects. The suggestion to see a doctor was a deflection. The extra strong coffee today was a test, or perhaps an escalation. The grief that hit me was not hot, but arctic. It froze everything inside me solid. My love for her, my memories of her as a child, my trust, they were not shattered, but instantly preserved in ice. I felt nothing. I was a vessel filled with a cold, heavy substance. I had a choice. I could confront her. I could call the police. Both actions would end in a form of destruction. I was not ready for that. First, I needed to know what was in the vial. I needed to understand the mechanism. Then, I needed to understand the motive. The fear was still there, but it was a distant thing. It was overshadowed by a more powerful force, a determined, calculating calm. I had been a victim of a slow, clandestine attack. That phase was over. The next phase was mine to define. I stood up. My body ached, but the ache was irrelevant. I had work to do. The first step was identification. I would need a sample. I would need to be careful. And I would need to behave absolutely normally until I had my answers. The performance was now mine to give. That evening, when Simone asked how my day was, I smiled. It felt like moving muscles that had atrophied. "Quiet," I said. "I rested." "Good," she replied, her eyes scanning my face. "You look a little better." "I feel a bit better," I lied. The coffee's effects still hummed in my veins, but the new clarity was stronger. I was in my own home, but I was behind enemy lines. Every word was intelligence. Every glance was reconnaissance. The shadow in the medicine cabinet had a shape now. It was small, glass, and full of silent, patient malice. I needed a sample. The vial remained behind the towels, a silent witness to my new understanding. The following day, a Wednesday, Simone announced she would be working late on her presentation. "Don't wait up for dinner, Mama. I'll grab something at the office." I nodded, my face a mask of maternal concern. "Don't work too hard." The words tasted like ash. Once her car disappeared down the street, I moved. I went to the hall closet and retrieved a small, clean contact lens case I had saved. I took it to her bathroom. The process was methodical. I put on disposable cleaning gloves. I opened the linen cabinet, reached behind the towels, and retrieved the vial. My hands did not shake. I was a professional collecting a specimen. I unscrewed the dropper top. I drew a small amount of the clear liquid into the dropper. I squeezed a single drop into one of the contact case's reservoirs. I closed it. I repeated the process, placing a second drop into the other reservoir, a backup. I wiped the dropper tip clean with a tissue, recapped the vial, and returned it to its precise hiding place. I disposed of the gloves and the tissue in the kitchen trash, under other debris. I placed the sealed contact lens case in the inner pocket of my winter coat, hanging in the hall closet. It was safe, and it was cold there. That night, I waited until the house was dark and silent. I heard Simone come in, move quietly to her room, and shut the door. I waited another hour. Then I went to the study, the room that had been Charles's. The desktop computer was old, but it functioned. I turned it on. The blue light of the monitor was the only illumination in the room. I began my search. I described the symptoms: gradual onset nausea, abdominal pain, hair thinning. I had noticed more strands in my brush. Peripheral neuropathy, a slight tingling in my feet I'd blamed on poor circulation, and cognitive effects. I paired them with clear, odorless liquid, viscous. I read medical journals, toxicology databases, and public health advisories. The answer emerged with a chilling simplicity: thallium, a heavy metal, odorless, tasteless, soluble in water. Its symptoms were a textbook match for my experience. It was known as the poisoner's poison for its stealth. It could be administered in small, cumulative doses. It caused a slow, debilitating decline that mimicked natural illness. In the past, it was found in rat poison. Now it could be obtained through certain chemical supply channels or on darker corners of the internet. I sat back in the chair, the blue light from the screen reflected on my glasses. I felt a hollow space open inside my chest. The clinical confirmation was worse than the suspicion. Suspicion lives in the realm of the possible. This was fact. My daughter was poisoning me with thallium. I thought of the vial, 3/4 full. How many doses remained? How many had she already given me? What was the intended endpoint? A fatal cardiac arrest? Organ failure? Something that would look to a busy doctor like the natural failure of a middle-aged woman with a stressful past? A cold, dry tremor began in my hands. I clasped them together in my lap to stop it. This was not fear. It was the body's reaction to an existential shock. I breathed in through my nose, out through my mouth. The nurse's training held. I read about treatments, Prussian blue, chelation therapy. Effectiveness depended on early intervention. How much damage was done? The questions were clinical and they kept me from crumbling. I closed the browser. I cleared the history. I powered down the computer. In the darkness, I listened to the sounds of the house, the hum of the refrigerator, the creak of a settling floorboard. The house felt like a shell. Everything inside it was false. The next morning, I observed, I was a scientist studying a deadly organism. I got up before Simone and pretended to be asleep when I heard her stir. I needed to watch the ritual from the beginning. I stood just inside my cracked bedroom door. I saw her go into the kitchen. I heard the grinder. Then there was a pause, a longer pause than just scooping coffee. A cabinet opened, not the one with the mugs. A drawer slid shut. Quiet, deliberate movements. She appeared in the hallway carrying 2 mugs. She set mine on the small table outside my door, a habit she'd started when I was feeling poorly. "Coffee's here, Mama," she called softly before heading back to the kitchen with her own. I waited until I heard her at the kitchen table. I opened my door and retrieved the mug. I looked at it. Dark liquid, steam rising. It looked innocent. It smelled like coffee. I carried it to the kitchen. She looked up from her phone, smiling. "You're up." "I am." I set the mug down on the counter near the sink. "I think I want tea this morning. My stomach feels off." Her smile tightened at the corners. "But I already made it. It's your favorite blend." "I know, baby. Thank you. I'll have it later." I filled the kettle. I could feel her eyes on my back. The silence was thick. "Suit yourself," she said, her voice light again. She took a long drink from her own mug. She did not touch mine. She left it sitting on the counter when she went to get dressed. I poured boiling water over a tea bag. I did not look at the coffee mug. I had my confirmation. The poison was in my dedicated mug, prepared in a separate, clandestine step. Her coffee was safe. The method was clear. I carried my tea to the table. The plan formed with a stark, logical clarity. Confrontation was premature. Accusation without irrefutable proof would lead to denial, to rage, to her disposing of the evidence, or to an escalation I might not survive. I needed her to be caught in the act. I needed her to experience the consequence. The concept was simple. If the poison was in my mug and not in hers, then transferring the contents from my mug to hers would reverse the vector. It would turn her weapon back on her. It was not about murder. I knew that with absolute certainty. I was a healer, not a killer. This was about evidence, about demonstration. If she became ill from her own coffee, she would know that I knew. The shock of it, the physical proof, might break the facade. It would force a reckoning. It was the only way to get to the truth behind the action. The decision calmed me. The tremors stopped. The hollow feeling filled with a purpose as cold and dense as iron. I would do it tomorrow. I would need precision, timing, and nerve. I finished my tea. I stood, walked to the sink, and poured the untouched coffee down the drain. I washed the mug thoroughly. I placed it in the dish rack. Simone came into the kitchen, ready for work. She glanced at the empty dish rack, then at me. "Changed your mind about the coffee." "It went cold," I said, meeting her gaze. "I prefer it hot." Something flickered in her eyes too fast to name, uncertainty perhaps. "Tomorrow, then," she said and kissed my cheek. "Yes," I said, "tomorrow." I woke before dawn. My body was a wire pulled taut. There was no nausea, only a hyper-alert clarity. Today was the day of the silent exchange. I lay in bed and rehearsed the movements. The timing would be everything. I heard Simone's alarm, then her footsteps to the bathroom. The shower ran. This was my window. I rose, put on my robe, and went to the kitchen. I prepared 2 coffee mugs. Not the chipped one Charles gave me. That was too loaded with sentiment, and I needed neutrality. I chose 2 plain white ceramic mugs from the set we used for guests. They were identical in every way. I placed them side by side on the counter. I made the coffee. I poured the fresh brew into both mugs, filling them to the same level. I added a spoon of sugar to each, stirring both with the same spoon. I placed a spoon in each mug. They were perfect mirrors of each other. This was the baseline. I heard the shower stop. I had minutes. I opened the refrigerator and took out the cream. I placed it between the 2 mugs. This was the prop, the reason for my presence at the counter when she arrived. Simone entered the kitchen, her hair damp, dressed for work. She smiled when she saw me. "You're up early. Feeling better?" "A bit," I said. I kept my voice even. I gestured to the mugs. "I made coffee for us, trying to be useful." Her smile didn't falter, but her eyes darted to the mugs, then to me. "That's sweet of you, Mama, but you should rest." She moved forward, her hand reaching for one of the mugs. "I used the new beans," I said, picking up the cream. "Do you want any in yours?" My action blocked her direct path to the mugs, forcing a pause. "No, black is fine." She waited, her posture relaxed, but her gaze was fixed on the mugs. She was assessing which was which, but there was no distinction. "Suit yourself," I said, mimicking her words from the day before. I poured a small amount of cream into the mug on my left. "This one's mine, then." I stirred it slowly, the spoon clinking softly against the ceramic. This established ownership. The mug with cream was now publicly, visibly mine. The untouched black coffee was ostensibly hers. I turned to put the cream away in the refrigerator. This was the critical moment. My back was to her for approximately 3 seconds. It was enough. As I opened the fridge door, my left hand, hidden by the door's bulk, moved. I quickly swapped the positions of the 2 mugs on the counter. The mug with cream, now on the right, was where the black coffee had been. The black coffee was now on the left, in front of the space where I had been standing. I closed the refrigerator door and turned around. I picked up the mug now in front of me. The black coffee, the one that was supposed to be clean. I took a small, deliberate sip. "It's good," I said. Simone watched me, then reached for the other mug, the one with the cream, the one she believed was mine, the one I had just poisoned in our unspoken ritual. Her fingers closed around the handle. "You sure you don't want me to make a fresh pot? This has probably been sitting." "It's fresh. I just made it." I held my mug with both hands, feeling the heat seep into my palms. My heart was a steady, hard knock against my ribs. She lifted the mug. She brought it to her lips. I watched her throat move as she swallowed. The act was so ordinary, so mundane. A daughter drinking morning coffee. She lowered the mug. "It is good," she said, but her tone was absent, her mind already on her day. We stood there in the kitchen, drinking our coffee. The silence was a third presence. I cataloged every sensation. The bitter taste of clean coffee on my tongue, the warmth in my hands, the faint steam from her mug, the clock ticking on the wall. "Big day at the office?" I asked, making conversation. The normalcy of the question felt grotesque. "The presentation. I'm nervous." She took another drink. "You'll be brilliant." The words were automatic, a mother's refrain. I meant none of them. I was observing a subject in a trial. She finished her coffee first. She placed the empty mug in the sink. I should get my things. All right. I continued to sip mine slowly. I had to make it convincing. She paused at the kitchen doorway. "Will you be okay today?" I looked at her. I looked at my daughter, the poisoner. Her expression was one of routine concern. "I'll be fine," I said. "You have a good day." She nodded and left. I heard her gather her bag, her keys. The front door opened and closed. The lock engaged. I stood alone in the kitchen. I placed my half-finished mug of black coffee on the counter. I walked to the sink and looked at her empty mug. A faint tan residue lined the bottom where the cream had been. Inside that residue was the thallium. The switch was complete. The trap was sprung. Now there was nothing to do but wait for the mechanism to engage. I felt no triumph, no satisfaction, only a suspended stillness, as if the air in the house had been replaced with something heavier. I had set a process in motion that I could not recall. The coffee she drank was the same dose she had been giving me. I knew its effects intimately. I knew the timetable. I washed both mugs. I washed them with hot water and soap, scrubbing every surface. I placed them in the dish rack to dry. The kitchen was clean. There was no evidence of the exchange, only the evidence that would soon manifest in her body. The morning stretched before me, long and silent. I did not sit down. I paced from room to room. I checked the clock. 30 minutes. That's when the first cramp would likely begin for her. A subtle, nagging pain. She would blame stress or something she ate. I stood in the living room looking out the front window at the empty street. I had done it. I had turned her weapon back on her. The action was one of defense, of demonstration, of forcing a truth into the open. I told myself it was not revenge. It was a statement, a question posed in the only language she had chosen to use. By noon, I expected the call where her voice would be tight with discomfort, where she would say she was coming home sick. That would be the first sign. That would be the moment the performance cracked. I waited. The house was so quiet I could hear the hum of the refrigerator, the settling of the old bones of the building. I was a sentinel in my own home, guarding a terrible secret I had just enacted. The coffee sat in my stomach, harmless and bitter. The real poison was now inside her, and with it the seed of our reckoning. The call came at 11:47 a.m. My phone vibrated on the kitchen table. I looked at the screen. Simone. I let it ring 3 times before answering. My voice was calm. "Hello?" "Mama." Her voice was thin, strained. I don't feel well. I'm coming home." "What's wrong?" I asked, the picture of concern. "My stomach, cramps, a headache. I'm dizzy. I think it might be food poisoning." She sounded frightened, not just sick. "Come home, baby. I'll be here." I ended the call. I placed the phone back on the table. I looked at my hands. They were steady. I felt a cold, hollow clarity. The experiment was yielding results. I heard her car in the driveway 20 minutes later. The engine cut off. The front door opened and closed. Her footsteps were unsteady in the hallway. She appeared in the kitchen doorway, her face pale, a sheen of sweat on her forehead. She leaned against the doorframe. "You should lie down," I said, rising from my chair. She didn't move. Her eyes, wide and confused, scanned my face. "Mama, I feel terrible." "I know the feeling," I said. My tone was neutral. I did not move to help her. She blinked, as if processing the words. Her gaze drifted past me to the counter, to the dish rack where the 2 clean white mugs sat, her eyes fixed on them. A slow, dawning horror began to erase the sickness from her expression, replacing it with something far worse, understanding. Her breath hitched. She looked from the mugs to me. Her mouth opened, but no sound came out. The color, what little was left, drained completely from her face. I remained standing by the table. I said nothing. I simply watched the realization crash over her. "You," she whispered. The word was a puff of air. Her hand went to her stomach. "My coffee." "It was very good coffee," I said. "You made it perfectly, as always." She staggered forward, gripping the back of a kitchen chair. Her knuckles were white. "What did you do?" Her voice was louder now, edged with panic. "I drank my coffee," I said, "and you drank yours." I let the statement hang in the air between us. The kitchen was silent except for the sound of her ragged breathing. She stared at me, her eyes searching mine for mercy, for confusion, for anything but what she saw. What she saw was a wall of cold, implacable knowledge. The performance was over, for both of us. "You switched them," she said. It wasn't a question. "I observed a contamination issue," I said, my voice clinical. I hypothesized that the contaminant was introduced into a specific vessel after the brewing process. This morning, I tested the hypothesis by standardizing the variables and altering a single parameter, the final destination of each vessel. You have just confirmed my hypothesis by presenting with the expected adverse effects. My use of clinical language, the detached tone, it shattered her completely. This was not her emotional mother, this was the nurse, the scientist who had uncovered her plot. She began to shake, not just tremble, but a full, uncontrollable shaking. She sank into the chair. "I'm sick," she moaned, bending forward. "Yes," I agreed. "The symptoms are nausea, abdominal cramping, headache, vertigo. They will intensify over the next several hours. Peripheral neuropathy may follow, cognitive fogginess, hair loss. Is that the expected progression, Simone?" Her head snapped up. Hearing the clinical catalog of her own weapon's effects broke the last of her defenses. A low, wounded sound escaped her throat. She was cornered, exposed, and physically failing. The poison was in her, and I knew exactly what it was. "Why?" The word tore out of me then, sharp and raw, slicing through the clinical facade. It was the only question that mattered. She wrapped her arms around herself, rocking slightly. Tears streamed down her face, but they were not tears of remorse. They were tears of terror and defeat. Her voice, when it came, was a shattered whisper, barely audible. "He made me promise." The room seemed to tilt. "Who?" She looked at me, her eyes filled with a twisted, childlike anguish. "Daddy." The word landed like a physical blow. I had braced myself for greed, for resentment, for some modern malice. I was not prepared for a ghost. "What are you talking about?" My voice was low, dangerous. Simone choked on a sob, clutching her stomach. "When he was dying, in the hospital, you'd step out to get coffee, to talk to the doctors." She sucked in a ragged breath. "He was so clear. He told me. He said you were tired of him. He said you talked to the doctors about letting him go. He said you wanted his suffering to end because it was hard for you." The words spilled out in a frantic, desperate rush. "He made me promise. He made me swear on his life that I would make sure you didn't get away with it, that you would join him. He said it was the only way to make it right. He made me promise, Mama. He was my daddy. I promised." I stood perfectly still. The air in the kitchen was gone. I could not breathe. The foundation of my past, of my grief, of my identity as a wife and caregiver, cracked and fell into a black chasm. Charles? My Charles? In his pain, in his morphine haze, in his own dying terror, he had weaponized our daughter's love. He had planted a seed of monstrous betrayal in her heart and watered it with a lie. The motive was not hatred. It was a warped, poisoned sense of fidelity, a daughter keeping a promise to a ghost. I looked at Simone, weeping and sick in the chair. My child, my victim, my would-be killer. The rage that filled me was so vast, so white-hot it was indistinguishable from ice. It was directed at the man in the grave, at the sick, confused mind that had conceived this, and at the woman before me who had nurtured it for years. "He was wrong," I said, my voice utterly flat. I fought for him. Every day. I begged them for every treatment, every extra moment. I never let him go. His mind let him go. The disease let him go. But I never did. She stared at me, her face a mask of confusion and pain. The truth I spoke did not fit the story she had lived with for years. It could not penetrate the fortress of her promise. "The vial," I said. "Where did you get it?" She shook her head, a weak, dismissive gesture. Online, a chemistry forum. It took months to find. She said it as if describing a difficult shopping trip. I turned and walked to the sink. I filled a glass with water. I brought it back and set it on the table in front of her. I did not hand it to her. Drink water. It won't help, but it's something to do. I left her there, slumped in the chair. I walked to the living room and stood in the center of the quiet space. The shock was settling into my bones, cold and heavy. My husband had sentenced me to death from his deathbed. My daughter had been the willing executioner. The betrayal was double-layered, spanning years and realms of existence. I had survived the poison. I was not sure I would survive this truth, but I had to, because the reckoning was no longer just with Simone. It was with a memory, and I needed proof. I left Simone in the kitchen. I heard her retching in the downstairs powder room a few minutes later. The sound was clinical data to me now, a confirmation of dosage. I did not go to her. I put on my coat, picked up my purse, and walked out the front door. I needed air that was not poisoned by confession. I drove without a clear destination. My hands guided the car through familiar streets until I found myself in the parking lot of my church, the New Hope Baptist. It was a Wednesday afternoon. The building was quiet, but Pastor Jacobs's old sedan was in his designated spot. He often worked on his sermons in the study during the week. I sat in my car for a few minutes, watching the empty playground beside the church. Then I got out and walked to the side door that led to the administrative offices. I knocked on the pastor's open door. He looked up from his desk, his reading glasses perched on his nose. A smile spread across his face, warm and immediate. Eleanor Hayes. This is a pleasant surprise. The smile faded as he took in my expression. Come in. Sit down. I entered the small, book-lined study and took the chair across from him. The room smelled of old paper and lemon wood polish. Pastor, I began, then stopped. How did one frame this? I need to talk, not as a parishioner seeking counsel exactly, but as a person who has discovered something terrible, a betrayal. He leaned forward, folding his hands on the desk. His expression was attentive, not alarmed. I'm listening. If a person, I said, choosing my words with care, were to carry out a harmful act against another person because they believed they were fulfilling a promise to a third party, a promise based on a fundamental misunderstanding of events, where does the blame lie? He was silent for a moment. That is a heavy question. The blame for the action lies with the person who acted. They made a choice. But the weight of the guilt, the moral burden, that can be shared by others, especially by those who plant lies in fertile soil. The Bible speaks of not bearing false witness. A false witness can be a weapon that kills long after the words are spoken. I nodded slowly. And if the third party is no longer living, if the only record of the lie is in the memory of the one who acted, then the truth becomes a task for the living, he said gently. It is hard work to dismantle a monument built on a lie. It requires evidence, not just of the truth, but often of the lie's origin. Why would the third party have said such a thing? Were they confused, angry, ill? Ill. The word hung in the air between us. Charles had been ill, terminally ill. His body was not the only thing that had failed. Thank you, Pastor, I said, standing. The conversation had not given me answers, but it had given me a direction, a task. Eleanor, he said as I turned to leave, this person who was betrayed, are they safe now? I met his gaze. They are in control of the situation now. They are deciding what happens next. He held my look for a long moment, then gave a single, slow nod. Then I will pray for their wisdom and for mercy in whatever form it needs to take. I drove home. The house was silent. I went upstairs and saw Simone's bedroom door was closed. I did not open it. I went to the hall closet and pulled down the cardboard box labeled Charles' Desk. I carried it into my bedroom. I opened the box. It contained his journals, the ones he kept sporadically during his illness. He had never been a consistent writer, but in his final years, he sometimes jotted down thoughts, medical updates, fragments. I had packed them away, unable to read them in the raw aftermath of his death. They had sat in the closet for years, a silent repository of pain I had chosen to avoid. Now, I needed to read them. I needed evidence of the lie's origin. I sat on the floor with the box. I opened the first journal, a leather-bound book from the year of his diagnosis. The early entries were pragmatic: doctors' names, medication lists, side effects. His handwriting was strong, clear. Then, as the pages progressed, the entries grew less frequent. The handwriting began to change. About 18 months before his death, the shifts began. A sentence would start clearly and then degenerate into a cramped, shaky script. Sometimes the words were misspelled. There were paranoid notes about the nurses. The night nurse looks at me with pity. I hate her pity. She thinks I'm already dead. Another. Ellie was late today. She says traffic. I think she dreads coming. My breath caught. Here was the seed. I turned the page. The entries became more disjointed. He wrote about pain, about fear. Then, 6 months before the end, I found it. A paragraph, the writing so angular and tight it was difficult to read. Spoke to Dr. Shaw today. He used the word palliative. Ellie was there. She nodded. She didn't fight him. She is tired. I see it. She wants it to be over. She talks to them in the hall. They listen to her. My wife is planning my death with them. She has the power. I have none. Simone is the only one who sees. My good girl. She still has fight in her. She will remember. She will make it right. I closed the journal. My hands were cold. This was the monument. In his pain, his fear, his chemical haze of morphine and disease, he had twisted my exhausted advocacy, my desperate conferences with doctors, into a narrative of abandonment and conspiracy. My love had looked like complicity. My fatigue had looked like eagerness. I pulled out the photo albums from the same box. I turned to the pages from that final year. There were few pictures. The ones that existed told their own story. In one, Charles sat in a wheelchair in the garden. I stood behind him, my hands on his shoulders. My smile was strained, my eyes shadowed with sleeplessness. He was looking away from the camera, his expression blank. In another, Simone leaned down to hug him in his hospital bed. His face was turned toward her, and his expression. It was one of intense, desperate focus. A drowning man clinging to a raft. I saw it then. The isolation he must have felt. The powerlessness. He had transferred his trust from me, the caretaker who represented the unbearable reality of his decline, to Simone, the visitor who offered uncomplicated love and the energy of youth. He had made her his ally against the world, and in his distorted mind, that world included me. The evidence was all here, not of my guilt, but of his psychological undoing. The lie was not born of malice, but of a sick mind's attempt to make sense of its own annihilation. He had handed his fear to our daughter like a cursed heirloom, and she had accepted it. I placed the journal and the photo album back in the box. I had my evidence. The truth was uglier than I had imagined, but it was truth. It did not absolve Simone. It explained her. An explanation was a form of power. I now understood the battlefield completely. The next move was mine. I held the evidence in my hands. The journal lay on my bed, open to the damning page. The photograph was beside it. The truth was no longer a theory. It was a collection of objects. I felt a calm, steely resolve. The time for confrontation had come. Simone had been in her room for over 24 hours. I had left water and plain toast outside her door. She had taken them. I heard the sounds of her illness, the retching, the moans. I monitored them as a nurse would, noting the progression and peak. The acute phase was passing. She would be weak, Dehydrated but coherent, vulnerable. I prepared. I showered, dressed in simple slacks and a sweater. I brushed my hair and pinned it back. I needed to look composed, unassailable. I picked up the journal and the photograph. I walked down the hall to her bedroom. I did not knock. I turned the knob and entered. The room was dim, the blinds drawn. Simone was a lump under the covers on her bed. She stirred as light from the hallway fell across her face. She squinted at me, then her eyes widened in alarm. She pushed herself up onto her elbows. She looked terrible, pale, her hair matted, dark circles under her eyes. "Mama." "Sit up, Simone," I said. My voice was quiet, but it held no warmth. It was an instruction. She hesitated, then struggled to comply, leaning back against her headboard. She pulled the covers up to her chin, a childlike gesture of protection. I turned on her bedside lamp. The soft light illuminated her fearful face and the objects in my hands. I placed the photograph on the comforter in front of her. It was the one from the hospital of her hugging Charles. "Look at his face," I said. She glanced down, then away. "I don't want to see that." "Look at it," I repeated, the command absolute. She looked. Her breath hitched as she saw the intensity in her father's gaze, fixed on her. "He loved me," she whispered. "He was clinging to you," I corrected. "There is a difference. He was drowning, and you were the only piece of driftwood he could see. I was the ocean." She shook her head, denying it. I opened the journal to the marked page. I held it out so she could read the cramped, paranoid writing. "Read this entry, the one dated March 14th. Read it aloud." She stared at the page as if it were a venomous snake. "I can't." "Read it." Her eyes scanned the words. Her lips moved silently. Then, haltingly, she began to read. "Spoke to Dr. Shaw today. He used the word palliative. Ellie was there." She nodded. "She didn't fight him." Her voice grew thinner as she continued. "She is tired, I see it. She wants it to be over. My wife is planning my death with them. Simone is the only one who sees. My good girl. She will remember. She will make it right." The final phrase hung in the stale air of the room. She looked up at me, her face ashen. "That is the promise," I said, taking the journal back. "That is the lie he planted in you. He was not of sound mind, Simone. The disease, the drugs, the pain, they eroded his reason. What you saw as clarity was delirium. What you heard as a sacred vow was the manifesto of a crumbling mind." "You're lying," she said, but the words had no force. They were a reflex. "I have 32 years of medical experience. You have a vial of poison from the internet. Which of us is better equipped to diagnose mental deterioration?" I let the question sit. I fought for him every single day. I never once discussed letting him go. I discussed managing his pain. I discussed dignity. He twisted that into a plot against him, and he recruited you as his avenging angel. Tears welled in her eyes, but they were tears of confusion, of a foundation cracking. "He was my daddy, and I am your mother, and you have been poisoning me for weeks based on the ramblings of a sick, scared, dying man." I stated it as the plain fact it was. You are not a keeper of a promise. You are a victim of a manipulation that extended beyond the grave, and you have become a perpetrator. The word perpetrator made her flinch. She wrapped her arms around herself. "Now," I said, my voice dropping to a low, even register, "we arrive at the consequences. You have committed a serious crime, attempted murder. I have physical evidence. The vial, my medical records, which will show thallium poisoning if I choose to get tested. The samples I took from the vial. Your confession, which I have recorded on my phone from our conversation in the kitchen." I had done no such thing, but she did not know that. She believed I was capable of it. That was enough. Her eyes darted around the room, looking for an escape that did not exist. "You're going to call the police. That is one option, I acknowledged. You would be arrested, charged, and likely imprisoned. Your life would be over. The community would know. The shame would be public and permanent. She began to cry in earnest, silent, shaking sobs. There is a second option, I said. It is not forgiveness. It is not absolution. It is a choice I am offering once. She looked up, a flicker of desperate hope in her eyes. You will be committed to a private psychiatric facility, a place that deals with trauma, with delusion, with profound psychological disturbance. You will go there voluntarily under my authority. You will undergo evaluation and treatment. You will confront not just what you did, but why you were so willing to believe the lie. You will unravel the promise. I paused. It will not be pleasant. It will be a kind of prison, but one with a purpose other than punishment. The purpose will be truth. For how long? She whispered. For as long as it takes. Months. Possibly a year or more. You will not leave until the professionals there, and I are convinced the person who comes out is no longer a threat to me or to herself. And if I say no, then I pick up the phone, and you face the justice of the state. I will testify against you. I will show them the evidence. She was trapped, and she knew it. And the power had completely shifted. I was no longer the victim in the kitchen. I was the judge, offering a sentence I had designed. She wiped her face with the edge of the sheet. She looked small, broken, and very young. What will you tell people? That you have had a severe mental health crisis stemming from unresolved grief over your father, that you are seeking intensive treatment. It will be true. It will preserve a shred of dignity for this family. It is more than you deserve, but it is the choice I am making. She was silent for a long time, staring at her hands. The clock on her nightstand ticked. Finally, she nodded, a barely perceptible movement. The facility. You agree? Voluntarily? Yes. The word was a surrender. We will leave tomorrow morning, I said. I turned and walked to the door. I stopped with my hand on the knob. Pack a bag, practical clothing, nothing else. We leave at 8. I did not wait for a response. I closed the door behind me. I stood in the hallway, the journal still in my hand. My heart was a steady, cold drum. I had offered her a path that looked like mercy but was, in its own way, a form of vengeance. The vengeance of enforced clarity, of being made to stare at the ruin she had almost caused and the lies that had built it. It was not the revenge of violence. It was the revenge of truth. And it would, I believed, hurt far more in the long run. The next morning at 8 o'clock, Simone emerged from her room. She carried a single small suitcase. She was dressed in jeans and a plain sweatshirt, her hair pulled back. Her face was still pale, but the acute sickness had passed, replaced by a hollow-eyed exhaustion. She did not look at me. Is that everything? I asked, standing by the front door. Yes. We'll take my car. She nodded mechanically. I had already placed a folder on the passenger seat containing the paperwork, the pre-admission forms I had secured through a discreet referral from an old medical colleague, my legal documentation as her next of kin, and a notarized statement of voluntary commitment. I had spent the previous evening on the phone and online, ensuring every detail was correct. This was not a panicked decision. It was a transaction. We got into the car. I started the engine. Simone stared straight ahead through the windshield. I backed out of the driveway. We did not speak. The facility, Pine Ridge Behavioral Health Center, was a 2-hour drive away, in a wooded rural area. The silence in the car was absolute. It was not a comfortable silence. It was a thick, heavy substance that filled the space between us. I focused on the road, the highway stretching out, then the smaller state routes, finally a county road winding through pine forests. Simone spoke only once, about an hour into the drive. Her voice was flat. Will there be phones? There will be regulated communication, I said. After an initial evaluation period, all correspondence will be monitored. She absorbed this. So I'm a prisoner. You are a patient, I corrected. A prisoner has no expectation of healing. You do. That is the difference I am paying for. She lapsed back into silence. I saw her hands clenched in her lap, the knuckles white. We turned onto a long, paved drive marked by a simple, tasteful sign, Pine Ridge. The building came into view. It was not the grim asylum of imagination. It was a modern, low-slung complex of brick and glass, surrounded by tall trees and fenced gardens. It looked clean, quiet, and utterly isolated. The isolation was the point. I parked in the visitor lot. Leave your suitcase. They will check it. We walked to the main entrance. The automatic doors slid open with a soft hiss. The lobby was bright with comfortable chairs and potted plants. It smelled of disinfectant and floor polish. A woman in professional attire sat behind a secure reception window. She looked up as we approached. "Eleanor Hayes for a 10:30 admission," I said. "Yes, Mrs. Hayes, we've been expecting you." She buzzed us through a heavy door to a smaller, more clinical admissions office. A man in a blazer and a woman in a therapist's cardigan were waiting. They introduced themselves as the intake coordinator and the clinical supervisor. The process was efficient. I presented the paperwork. They reviewed it, asked Simone a series of standard questions to confirm she was entering voluntarily, and understood the basic parameters. She answered in monosyllables. Yes. No. I understand. I handed over the folder with my documents. The coordinator placed them in a file. The initial commitment period is 90 days, after which her case will be reviewed by our team. You will be updated after the first 30-day assessment. Thank you, I said. The therapist turned to Simone. Simone, we're going to go through to the assessment wing now. A nurse will check your vitals, and then we'll have a more detailed conversation. You can say goodbye to your mother here. Simone turned to look at me. For a moment, the numb shell cracked, and raw terror shone through. She was a little girl again, about to be left in a strange place. Her lips trembled. She didn't speak. I looked back at her, my expression calm, impassive. I felt nothing but the cold satisfaction of a completed task. This was the consequence. This was the road to nowhere she had chosen when she first tipped the vial into my coffee. "Goodbye, Simone," I said. A single tear traced a path down her cheek. She swallowed hard, the child's fear receding, replaced by the grim understanding of the adult. She had chosen this to avoid a worse fate. She gave a stiff, small nod. Then she turned and followed the therapist through another secured door. It closed behind her with a solid, muffled thud. The sound of a lock engaging was audible, a soft but definitive click. The intake coordinator handed me a packet of information. Visiting hours are on weekends. After the first 2 weeks, all visits must be pre-approved by her primary therapist. I understand. I took the packet. There's one more thing. I reached into my purse and retrieved the small glass vial, sealed inside a clear plastic evidence bag. I had handled it with gloves. I placed it on the counter. This was in her possession. It contains thallium, a heavy metal poison. She admitted to administering it to me. It is the central reason for her break with reality. I believe your toxicology screen will confirm her exposure. It should be handled with extreme care. The coordinator's professional composure flickered. He stared at the vial, then at me. This is evidence of a crime. It is evidence of a profound psychological disturbance, I said, which is why she is here and not in a county jail. I trust you will dispose of it appropriately and include this information in her clinical profile. He nodded slowly, using a pen to carefully move the bag to the side of his desk. We will. I left the admissions office. I walked back through the empty lobby, through the hissing automatic doors, into the cool forest air. I did not look back at the building. I got into my car. The passenger seat was empty. The folder was gone. I sat for a moment, listening to the engine idle. I had done it. I had removed the threat from my home. I had engineered a consequence that fit the crime, a punishment that looked like treatment. It was a civilized form of vengeance. I felt no elation, only a vast, quiet emptiness and the certainty that I had survived. I put the car in reverse, then drive. I began the 2-hour journey back to a house that was now, truly, my own. The road ahead was straight and clear. The house was exactly as I had left it, but the silence had a different quality. It was no longer a temporary condition, a pause between Simone's arrivals and departures. It was the new permanent state. I stood in the foyer, my keys in my hand, and listened to it. The hum of the refrigerator, the faint tick of the hall clock. The empty air seemed to press against my ears. I walked to the kitchen. The dish rack held a single plate, a single glass. I made a cup of tea. I did not sit at the table. I stood at the counter and drank it, looking out at the backyard. The garden was a tangle of brown stalks and weeds. Charles's garden. I turned away. The work began that afternoon. I started with her bathroom. I put on rubber gloves. I opened the linen cabinet and removed every towel, every washcloth. I reached to the very back and retrieved the small glass vial. It was still there, cold and innocuous. I placed it in a heavy-duty zip-top bag, then sealed that inside another. I put it on the counter. I cleaned the cabinet shelves with disinfectant. I wiped down every surface. I scrubbed the sink, the toilet, the shower. I removed all traces of her products from the glass shelf. The perfume, the moisturizers, the toothpaste. I placed them in a cardboard box. I left the bathroom bare, smelling of bleach and emptiness. Next, her bedroom. I opened the door. The bed was unmade, the sheets tangled. The room still held the faint, sour scent of sickness. I opened the windows first, letting the cold afternoon air sweep through. I did not sift through her belongings with sentiment. I was an archivist cataloging evidence of a life that was now in suspension. I took the suitcase she had packed and emptied it onto the bed. The clothes were practical, dull. I folded them and placed them back in the suitcase. That would be sent to the facility later. I opened her dresser drawers. I emptied them, sorting clothing into piles. Keep, donate, discard. The keep pile was small. The donate pile grew large. I filled trash bags with items that were worn or stained. I found the photo of her and Charles, the one from her graduation, on her nightstand. I looked at it. His face was proud, healthy. Hers was beaming with accomplishment. I placed it face down in the keep box. It was a piece of evidence, not a memory to cherish. In her closet on the high shelf behind sweaters, I found a small locked metal box. I did not have the key. I carried it to the garage, used a crowbar from Charles's old workbench, and pried it open. Inside were printouts, chemistry forum threads about solubility and toxicity, order confirmations from online suppliers with product names coded, receipts for cryptocurrency transactions, a handwritten list of my symptoms with dates, her research, her ledger. I felt a cold spike of anger, sharp and clean. This was the premeditation. This was the calculation. I took the contents and the box itself to the outdoor brick grill in the backyard. I doused them with lighter fluid and set them on fire. I stood and watched as the papers blackened and curled, the flames consuming her careful plans. The metal box glowed red. When it was ash and cooled metal, I used a shovel to break the remnants and bury them in the garden's waste pile. By evening, her room was empty. The bed was stripped. The surfaces were clear. The closet doors stood open, revealing empty hangers. The only items left were the suitcase of approved clothing and the single box of keep items, which I taped shut and carried to the attic. I pushed it into a corner behind the Christmas decorations. I returned to the kitchen. The bag containing the vial sat on the counter. I could not burn it. I could not pour it down the drain. It was evidence, and it was dangerous. I took it to the garage. I found a small, sturdy metal toolbox. I placed the bagged vial inside. I surrounded it with old rags. I locked the toolbox with a padlock. I carried it to the attic and placed it on a high, separate shelf, far from the box of her things. I labeled the shelf in my mind, Hazard, do not touch. I came downstairs. The silence was deeper now, having absorbed the day's activity. I made myself a simple dinner, scrambled eggs, toast. I ate at the kitchen table, alone. The sound of my own chewing was loud in the quiet. After washing my single plate, I walked through the house. I turned off lights. I checked the locks. My footsteps echoed in the hallway. I passed the open door to her dark, empty room. I did not close it. I left it open, a vacant space. I went to my own bedroom. The box of Charles's journals was still on the floor. I picked it up. I carried it to the attic as well. I did not place it near Simone's box. I put it on the opposite side, under the eaves. I left it there. I would deal with it later, or perhaps never. Back in my room, I prepared for bed. The routines were the same, but they felt newly mine. I brushed my teeth. I washed my face. I looked at my reflection in the mirror. The woman there looked tired, but her eyes were clear. The fog of poison was lifting. The clarity left behind was severe, but it was clarity. I lay in bed in the dark. The house did not creak or settle. It was profoundly still. I thought of Simone in her sterile room at Pine Ridge. Was she scared? Was she angry? Was she finally thinking? I did not know. I had removed her from my world. The revenge was not in her suffering, but in her absence. In the silence she had meant for me to become permanent, but which I had instead assigned to her. A sliver of doubt, thin and cold, slipped into my mind. Had I been too harsh? Was this justice, or merely a more sophisticated form of cruelty? I examined the doubt. I turned it over. Then I set it aside. The decision was made. The path was set. The house was quiet, and it was mine. For the first time in weeks, I slept through the night without waking to nausea or dread. I slept in the emptiness I had reclaimed. The silence persisted, but it became a space to inhabit, not just an emptiness to endure. Weeks passed. The symptoms receded day by day like a tide going out. The nausea faded first, then the cramps. The fuzziness in my thoughts cleared, leaving behind a sharp, sometimes painful lucidity. My body was shedding the poison. My mind was adjusting to the new landscape of my life. I established my own routines. I woke at dawn without an alarm. I would make my bed, dress, and go directly to the kitchen. I did not wait. I did not hesitate. I filled the kettle with fresh water. I measured out the coffee beans, a dark roast my choice, and ground them. The sound was familiar, but the ritual was entirely my own. I brewed a single cup in the French press. I did not add sugar. I tasted the bitterness, and I welcomed it. It was honest. On this particular morning, the sky outside the kitchen window was a deep indigo, just beginning to soften at the edges. I poured the hot water over the grounds, watching it bloom. As it steeped, I checked the mailbox. I had taken to doing this after making the coffee, a small task to complete the ritual. The air was cool and carried the scent of damp earth. I walked down the driveway. The neighborhood was still asleep. I opened the mailbox. Inside were the usual circulars, a bill, and a plain white envelope. The return address was printed neatly. Pine Ridge Behavioral Health Center. It was addressed to me in handwriting I recognized, but which seemed less assured, smaller somehow. I took the mail inside. I placed the circulars and the bill on the hall table. I carried the envelope into the kitchen. I set it on the table beside my waiting mug. I pressed the plunger on the French press, the grounds sinking to the bottom. I poured the dark, clear coffee into my mug. The steam rose in a fragrant curl. I carried the mug to the table and sat down. The envelope lay beside my right hand. I did not open it immediately. I took the first sip of my coffee. It was hot, strong, and perfectly bitter. It was safe. I owned every step of its creation. That knowledge was a quiet satisfaction, deeper than any flavor. I looked at the envelope. This was the first communication. The facility's rules allowed supervised correspondence after the initial 30-day assessment period. That period had passed. I had received a brief formal call from her primary therapist, Dr. Evans, stating that Simone was engaged in the process, that she was confronting the foundational trauma, and that it was challenging. I had thanked her and asked no further questions. Now, here was a direct word. I finished my coffee. The sky through the window was turning a pale gold. I picked up the envelope. I used a butter knife from the table to slit it open neatly. Inside was a single sheet of plain paper. The handwriting was the same as on the envelope. "Mom," they said I could write. They said I don't know what to say. I am supposed to be honest. I am tired. The days are long. We talk a lot about Dad, about you, about the poison. I have to say the words out loud. It is harder than I thought. Dr. Evans showed me the toxicology report from when I arrived, my own levels. It made it real in a different way. I knew what I was doing, but seeing it on paper, what was in me, what I put in you, it was different. I am not asking for anything. I am not allowed to, and I wouldn't know how. I am sorry for the coffee. I am sorry for the lies I believed. I am sorry for the fear. I am just sorry. Simone. The letter was short. There were no excuses, no justifications, no pleas. It was a statement of fatigue and a bare, unadorned apology. It was a beginning, perhaps only the very beginning. I read it twice. Then I folded it and placed it back inside the envelope. I set the envelope back on the table. I looked across the room at the small bookshelf. A framed photograph sat there. It was an older picture from before Charles got sick. The three of us at a park. He had his arm around me, and Simone, about 10, was grinning in front of us, a missing tooth in her smile. We looked happy. We were happy for that moment. I had not put the photo away. It was a fact of history, not a shrine. My gaze moved from the photo to the window. The sun was breaking above the roof of the house across the street, a brilliant sliver of light, then a steady, rising arc. The gold spilled into the kitchen, washing over the table, touching the envelope, warming my hands wrapped around the empty mug. I did not feel a surge of forgiveness. The wound was too deep, the betrayal too profound. What I felt was a cessation of active conflict, a quiet. The revenge was complete. It had taken the form of survival, of truth, and of imposing a consequence that demanded accountability. I had not destroyed her. I had forced a mirror in front of her. She was now looking into it. That was the extent of my victory. The future was unclear. There would be no swift reunion, no easy healing. The path from that facility, if she ever truly walked it, would be long and arduous. I did not know if I would be at the end of it. That was a choice for another day. Today I had my coffee. I had the sunrise. I had a letter that contained a seed of remorse. Nothing more. Nothing less. It was enough. It was a sign that the terrible stillness I had imposed had created a possibility, however faint, for something else to grow. A small, weary, but genuine smile touched my lips. It was not a smile of joy, but of recognition. I recognized my own strength. I recognized the dawn. I recognized that I was free. I stood up, picked up my mug and the envelope. I washed the mug and placed it in the dish rack. I carried the envelope to my desk in the study and placed it in a drawer. I would not reply today. Perhaps I would next week or next month. There was no urgency. I walked back to the kitchen. The room was full of light now, clean and bright. I looked out at the garden, a mess of winter neglect. Spring was coming. There would be work to do. I had survived. The story was not over, but the chapter of vengeance was closed. I turned from the window and began my day.